Behind you, Blue.
I got another door.
Okay, good. Blue.
Oh,
Blue. Good?
yep. Back around. Blue.
In January 2025, investigators arrived at a rural property in New Mexico carrying a search warrant that would change the entire direction of a missing persons case. For months, neighbors had passed the home without noticing anything unusual. The property looked quiet. Still. Ordinary. But detectives had begun to suspect something horrifying. The man everyone had been told ran away to Mexico with another woman may never have left the property at all. Craig Thetford had been missing for weeks. According to investigators, his wife, Deana Thetford, told family members and authorities that Craig had voluntarily disappeared. She claimed he emptied accounts, took cash, left town without warning. But almost immediately, investigators began finding inconsistencies. Craig stopped communicating entirely with relatives. There were no confirmed border crossings, no verified sightings, no evidence he had started a new life anywhere else. To the people who knew him, that silence felt deeply wrong. Then investigators received information that shifted the case dramatically. According to court records and public reporting, witnesses described suspicious activity at the property after Craig vanished. One witness allegedly reported heavy equipment being used near the couple's carport late at night. Investigators also learned surveillance cameras on the property had reportedly disappeared around the same time. At first, those details seemed disconnected. Later, detectives would believe they were critical. When authorities finally searched the property, investigators focused on an area beneath the carport that appeared altered. What they uncovered there transformed the case from a missing persons investigation into an alleged homicide. According to prosecutors, Craig Thetford's body had been concealed on the property for months. Authorities later alleged he had been shot during an argument inside the home before efforts were made to hide both the body and the crime itself. What began as a story about a husband who supposedly abandoned his family quickly became something far darker. A case investigators say involved deception, concealment, and a horrifying truth hidden in plain sight. This is the story of Craig Thetford. The husband authorities say never ran away at all. And the investigation that slowly unraveled an alleged cover-up, one disturbing detail at a time. Welcome back to Dark Case Files, where we dig beneath the headlines to understand the full story. Before we begin, a content note. Today's case involves alleged domestic homicide, concealment of a body, and graphic investigative details. Viewer discretion is advised. Now, to understand what happened here, you first need to understand who Craig Thetford was. Craig was described by family members as hardworking, private, and deeply connected to the people close to him. He wasn't someone who simply vanished without explanation. Friends later told investigators that Craig maintained regular contact with family. He had routines, responsibilities, people who expected to hear from him. That's why his disappearance immediately felt wrong. The case unfolded in New Mexico, a state known for wide open landscapes, isolated rural properties, and communities where neighbors often know one another by name. The Thetford's property sat in a relatively quiet area. From the outside, nothing about the home suggested it would soon become the center of a homicide investigation drawing national attention. But according to court records and public reporting, tensions inside the marriage may have been building long before Craig disappeared. And that's what makes this story so disturbing. Because unlike many true crime cases involving sudden violence from strangers, this one allegedly unfolded behind closed doors. Inside a home investigators say became both the crime scene and the hiding place. At first, police believed Craig might simply be missing voluntarily. Adults disappear all the time. Some leave relationships. Some cut off contact. Some start over. But experienced investigators know something else too. When a disappearance is staged, the smallest inconsistencies can expose everything. And in this case, those inconsistencies began piling up fast. Phone activity, Financial records. Contradictory timelines. Witness statements. Then came a devastating allegation from inside the family itself. One that would completely shift the direction of the investigation. By the time detectives returned to the property with a warrant, they were no longer searching for a missing man. They were searching for a body. And according to prosecutors, they found exactly that. In the months leading up to Craig Thetford's disappearance, people close to the family would later describe a household that appeared increasingly strained behind closed doors. Exactly what was happening inside the marriage between Craig and Deana Thetford remains known only to the people who lived there. But according to investigators and later court filings, tensions inside the relationship had reportedly been building for some time. From the outside, though, life continued as normal. Neighbors saw routine activity around the property. Family members still expected to hear from Craig regularly. Nothing publicly suggested the case would soon become a homicide investigation. And that's part of what made Craig's sudden silence so alarming. Because according to relatives, Craig was consistent. He called people back. He checked in. He maintained communication with family members and people close to him. He wasn't someone who vanished without explanation. Then, sometime in late 2024, communication abruptly stopped. At first, relatives reportedly believed Craig might simply be busy or away temporarily. Days passed. Then more days. Calls went unanswered. Messages received no response. And according to investigators, there was little to no verified digital activity connected to Craig after that point. No meaningful phone usage. No confirmed communication. No indication he was actively maintaining contact with anyone outside the property. For family members, the silence felt deeply unnatural. According to public reporting, when relatives began asking questions, Deana Thetford allegedly provided an explanation. She reportedly claimed Craig had left voluntarily. At different points, according to investigators, she allegedly suggested he had gone to Mexico. In other accounts, authorities said she implied Craig may have left with another woman. The story seemed designed to explain why nobody could reach him. But for the people who knew Craig best, the explanation didn't fully make sense. If Craig truly wanted to leave, why abandon communication completely? Why stop contacting his children? Why disappear without accessing important records or maintaining clear financial activity? And perhaps most importantly, why was there no evidence he had actually crossed the border? Investigators later checked repeatedly. Those questions slowly began drawing more attention. Then investigators reportedly started noticing other inconsistencies tied to the property itself. According to witness statements referenced in court documents, surveillance cameras that had previously been installed around the home were suddenly gone after Craig disappeared. At first, that detail seemed minor. Easy to explain away. But detectives would later view it very differently. At the time, the missing cameras seemed like a minor detail. Months later, investigators would believe they had uncovered the reason those cameras disappeared. Then came reports of unusual activity near the property's carport area. Witnesses allegedly described machinery or heavy equipment being used late at night after Craig vanished. One witness reportedly recalled activity near the concrete and dirt beneath the structure itself. Again, nothing immediately pointed investigators toward homicide. But piece by piece, the story Deana allegedly told people began colliding with physical evidence and witness accounts investigators could not ignore. And according to authorities, the contradictions kept growing. Family members reportedly became increasingly convinced something terrible had happened. Craig had not contacted anyone. There were no verified sightings. No proof he had voluntarily started over somewhere else. To those closest to him, it no longer felt like a disappearance. It felt like silence forced by something far darker. Still, at this stage, investigators lacked one critical thing. Direct evidence of violence. That changed when detectives reportedly received information from someone incredibly close to the household itself. According to court documents and public reporting, a witness later told investigators,
"This is the only way I've been able to have any communication with him, and I don't even know if it's him."
Wonder who he supposedly went fishing to Mexico with. See, we had a call like this a long time ago. Long story short, turned into a murder. But she was staying in the house 3 weeks after she'd murdered him, and she drug him out in the back porch and covered him up with a tarp. Kind of rings the same deal. Same story. All he went on a fishing trip. Well, he kept not showing up for work, and people were calling.
So he's
Thetford.
really nowhere to be seen.
No, ma'am, he's nowhere to be
I think
found.
everything
anywhere.
we've been told and heard is. Because I wasn't sure how you.
And I want to say something else, but I don't want to.
That Deana allegedly confessed to shooting Craig following an argument inside the home. The allegation transformed the case instantly. Suddenly, investigators were no longer looking at a man who may have disappeared voluntarily. They were potentially looking at homicide. And detectives began preparing a search warrant for the property. Because if the witness was telling the truth, there was a chance Craig Thetford had never left that home at all. It was early 2025 when investigators returned to the Thetford property with a search warrant. By now, detectives reportedly believed Craig Thetford was dead. The question was no longer whether a crime had occurred. The question was where the evidence had been hidden. The morning investigators arrived, the property looked quiet. But behind the scenes, according to court documents and public reporting, detectives had spent weeks building probable cause. Witness statements. Phone records. Financial activity. Contradictory timelines. Individually, none of it proved homicide. Together, investigators believed the pieces were beginning to form a much darker picture. Law enforcement officers secured the property while detectives and forensic personnel slowly began documenting the scene. Every structure. Every vehicle. Every patch of disturbed ground. According to investigators, attention quickly centered on the carport area connected to the home. Witnesses had pointed detectives there. And investigators reportedly noticed signs that sections beneath the structure appeared altered. Searches like this move slowly. Photographs are taken before anything is touched. Measurements are recorded. Investigators work carefully because once a scene is disturbed, evidence can disappear forever. For hours, detectives processed the area piece by piece. Then, according to prosecutors, they uncovered something horrifying. Authorities alleged Craig Thetford's remains had been concealed beneath debris on the property itself. Investigators later stated the body appeared to have been wrapped in plastic and hidden beneath the carport area for an extended period of time. For Craig's family, the discovery shattered any remaining hope that he might still be alive. The men they had searched for. The men they were told had abandoned his life voluntarily. Had allegedly never left the property at all. As forensic teams continued processing the scene, investigators began reconstructing what they believed happened inside the home. According to the medical investigation later referenced in public reporting, Craig suffered multiple gunshot wounds. Authorities also believed significant efforts had been made to conceal both the body and evidence connected to the alleged killing. And investigators now faced a disturbing possibility. This may not have been a spontaneous attempt to hide a death. According to prosecutors, it appeared someone may have spent months maintaining the illusion that Craig was simply missing. Detectives started rebuilding the timeline carefully. Phone records allegedly showed Craig's communication abruptly stopped. Financial activity investigators expected from someone starting over never materialized. There were no verified border crossings supporting the Mexico story authorities said had been repeated to family members. And then there were the statements. According to investigators, explanations about Craig's disappearance shifted over time. Details changed. Timelines moved. Some accounts reportedly contradicted physical evidence detectives later uncovered. The more investigators compared witness interviews against forensic findings, the more suspicious the missing person narrative appeared. But here's where the case took another shocking turn. Investigators weren't just looking at the alleged killing itself. They now believed there had been an organized attempt to hide the crime for months. According to court records and public reporting, investigators examined allegations involving heavy equipment used near the concealment area after Craig disappeared. Witnesses reportedly described machinery activity near the carport late at night. Authorities also investigated claims involving a tractor allegedly used around the property during the period Craig vanished. To detectives, those details suddenly carried enormous significance. Especially when combined with reports that surveillance cameras had disappeared from the property around the same time frame. Investigators would later argue those actions were not random. they believed they were part of an effort to conceal what happened. As evidence technicians continued documenting the scene, prosecutors later stated investigators uncovered signs supporting prolonged concealment efforts on the property itself. And emotionally, the impact on Craig's loved ones was devastating. For weeks, family members had searched for explanations. Many reportedly feared the worst long before authorities confirmed it. Now, according to investigators, those fears had become reality. Craig had not abandoned his family. Authorities believed he had been killed. From the investigators' perspective, the case was changing rapidly. What began as a possible voluntary disappearance was now evolving into an alleged domestic homicide investigation involving concealment, deception, and conflicting stories. And detectives were no longer asking whether Craig left voluntarily. They were asking who benefited from making people believe he did. By the time investigators finished processing the property, attention centered almost entirely on one person: Deana Thetford. And according to prosecutors, the evidence against her was growing rapidly. But there were still critical questions investigators needed answered. Most importantly, what exactly happened inside that house the night Craig disappeared? And if prosecutors were right, how long had the truth been buried beneath the property itself? By early 2025, investigators publicly identified Deana Thetford as the central suspect in Craig Thetford's death. According to court documents and public reporting, detectives believed Craig had been shot during an argument inside the home. Then came what prosecutors described as the cover-up. From the beginning, Deana's explanation had been relatively straightforward. According to investigators, she allegedly told family members and authorities that Craig left voluntarily. At various points, she reportedly claimed he may have traveled to Mexico. Other statements suggested he had possibly left with another woman. The narrative created a believable possibility. Adults do disappear voluntarily. Marriages collapse. People leave without warning. And in the earliest phase of the case, investigators reportedly considered exactly that. Maybe Craig wanted a new life. Maybe financial pressures played a role. Maybe there was someone else involved. But the deeper detectives looked, the more the story began to unravel. According to investigators, there was no confirmed evidence Craig crossed into Mexico. No reliable sightings. No meaningful phone activity after his disappearance. No indication he had continued using identification, communicating with friends, or maintaining relationships with family members. For the people closest to him, that silence remained impossible to ignore. Craig's relatives reportedly told investigators the behavior simply didn't match the man they knew. He wouldn't disappear without contacting his children. He wouldn't vanish without explanation. And he wouldn't willingly cut off every connection to his life all at once. That growing disbelief became one of the emotional driving forces behind the investigation. Meanwhile, investigators continued examining inconsistencies tied to the property itself. Witnesses allegedly described suspicious activity after Craig vanished. Statements reportedly conflicted with physical evidence. And detectives increasingly questioned whether the missing person narrative had been intentionally staged. Then the investigation took an even more devastating turn. According to public reporting and court documents, Deana Thetford's own daughter allegedly came forward with critical information. Investigators later stated the daughter reported that Deana confessed to shooting Craig following an argument inside the home.
So he's
Thetford.
really nowhere to be seen.
No, ma'am, he's nowhere to be
I think
found.
everything we've been told and heard is. Because I wasn't sure how you.
And I want to say something else, but I don't want to implicate her.
You need to say it.
When we first moved here, we were just having conversations, and she was like, and she didn't say she'd kill him, but she was like, if it happened, I'd be okay with it, kind of to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
The allegation changed everything. For detectives, this was no longer a collection of suspicious circumstances. It was a direct accusation tied to the alleged killing itself. And emotionally, it transformed the case in another way too. Because family testimony in homicide investigations often carries enormous weight. Not only because of what is said, but because of the emotional cost of saying it at all. According to investigators, the daughter's statement became one of the pivotal moments in the case. And for Craig's relatives, the realization was devastating. The person they believed could help explain Craig's disappearance was now accused of causing it. Still, investigators continued testing every possible explanation. Early in the case, authorities reportedly explored whether Craig left voluntarily, whether he fled financial issues, whether an affair or secret relationship could explain the disappearance. On paper, those theories initially appeared plausible. But investigators say the evidence kept dismantling them one by one. A voluntary disappearance usually leaves movement, transactions, communication, digital traces. According to detectives, Craig left behind none of those things. And then investigators uncovered something else. The body hadn't been abandoned somewhere remote. According to prosecutors, Craig had allegedly remained on the property the entire time. Neighbors had unknowingly driven past the concealment site for months. That revelation stunned even experienced investigators. Because cases involving staged disappearances can sometimes delay suspicion for weeks or even months. When there's no visible crime scene, no immediate body discovery, and a believable explanation for why someone left, investigators often begin with missing person protocols instead of homicide procedures. And according to former detectives who study these cases, that window of uncertainty can become critical, especially if someone is actively shaping the narrative from the beginning. Behavioral inconsistencies also became increasingly important. Investigators reportedly analyzed shifting timelines, conflicting explanations, changes in statements over time. Individually, each inconsistency may have seemed small. Together, prosecutors believed they pointed toward deliberate deception. And detectives now faced a theory far darker than the one they started with: that Craig's disappearance had allegedly been staged from the very beginning. For Craig's family, the truth was almost unbearable. What started as confusion had turned into grief, then shock, then anger. Relatives who once searched for signs Craig might still be alive were now confronting allegations that he had been dead the entire time. According to public reporting, family members described feeling betrayed by the story they had initially been told. And beneath all the headlines, all the court filings, and all the investigative details, there was still a man whose life had ended violently inside the place he called home. As prosecutors prepared formal charges, the case was no longer about proving Craig Thetford was dead. Now they had to prove who killed him, and whether the alleged concealment had been intentional from the very beginning. The courtroom battle was about to begin. In 2025, Deana Thetford was arrested and formally charged in connection with Craig Thetford's death. According to law enforcement statements and publicly available court records, the case had reached a critical turning point. What had begun as a missing persons investigation was now a homicide prosecution. The arrest was announced after investigators concluded a months-long inquiry into Craig Thetford's disappearance and the evidence found on the property. Authorities confirmed that charges had been filed following the discovery of human remains on the residence and the accumulation of investigative findings that, according to prosecutors, pointed toward foul play. News of the arrest quickly spread across media outlets. For Craig's family, it marked a devastating confirmation of what they had feared for months. For the public, it marked a dramatic shift in the case narrative. From a man who was believed to have walked away from his life, to a man investigators now said was taken from it. Local and national coverage revisited earlier details of the disappearance, reframing them through the lens of homicide allegations. Every inconsistency that once seemed minor was now being re-examined under a much darker light. According to prosecutors, the events inside the Thetford home followed a violent escalation. They allege that an argument occurred inside the residence in late 2024. During that confrontation, investigators believe Craig Thetford was shot. From there, prosecutors argue, the case shifted from violence to concealment. According to the state's theory, efforts were then made to hide Craig's body on the property itself, rather than moving it elsewhere. Investigators also allege that a false narrative was constructed in the aftermath. That narrative, according to prosecutors, suggested Craig had voluntarily left the home, possibly traveling to Mexico or beginning a new life elsewhere. Authorities contend this explanation was used to delay suspicion and misdirect both family members and investigators during the early stages of the disappearance. As with all criminal cases, Deana Thetford is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in a court of law. At the time of reporting, her defense position centers on challenging the state's interpretation of the evidence. Defense arguments, as reflected in public reporting, emphasize that allegations are not proof and that investigative conclusions must be tested in court. Legal representatives have also underscored the importance of due process, reminding the public that charges represent accusations, not convictions. The defense is expected to scrutinize the reliability of witness statements, the interpretation of forensic evidence, and the timeline constructed by investigators. As of now, court proceedings remain ongoing, and no final judicial determination has been made. According to court documents and investigative reporting, the prosecution's case is built on several key categories of evidence. First, witness testimony. This includes statements from individuals who allegedly observed suspicious activity around the property following Craig's disappearance, including reports of unusual nighttime activity near the carport area. Second, family testimony. Investigators reportedly cited statements from Craig's relatives describing his sudden and total lack of communication, which they argue was inconsistent with voluntary disappearance. A particularly significant element, according to public records, involves the alleged statement from Deana Thetford's daughter, who reportedly told investigators that her mother confessed to shooting Craig after an argument. Third, forensic findings. Authorities confirmed the recovery of human remains on the property, along with evidence suggesting concealment efforts had taken place. Medical examination reportedly indicated Craig suffered gunshot wounds, according to publicly released information. Fourth, physical and digital inconsistencies. Investigators pointed to the absence of verified travel records supporting claims that Craig left the country, as well as a lack of sustained financial or digital activity consistent with someone starting a new life elsewhere. Fifth, alleged concealment behavior. Reports reference the removal of surveillance equipment and possible use of machinery or heavy equipment in the area where remains were later discovered, though these claims remain part of the prosecution's allegations and are subject to legal scrutiny. Taken together, prosecutors argue this evidence supports a single conclusion: that Craig Thetford's disappearance was staged to conceal a homicide. However, these claims remain allegations to be tested in court. As of current public reporting, the case remains within the criminal justice process. Legal proceedings are ongoing, and no final verdict has been reached. The allegations against Deana Thetford have been formally filed, but the outcome of the case will ultimately depend on the presentation of evidence in court and the findings of a judge or jury. What began as a missing persons case evolved into an investigation prosecutors say exposed a carefully maintained lie. And according to investigators, the truth was hidden only a few feet away from where people searched for answers. But behind every headline and every courtroom filing was a man whose life ended violently. And a family left trying to understand how everything unraveled. And as the legal process moves forward, one question remains at the center of it all. Not just what happened to Craig Thetford, but how a disappearance story allegedly held together long enough to hide the truth in plain sight. Craig Thetford was more than a headline. More than a court case. More than an investigation. He was a father. A family member. Someone people expected to hear from again. And in many ways, that's what ultimately exposed the alleged deception in this case. The people who loved Craig refused to accept that he had simply vanished without explanation. They kept asking questions. And investigators kept digging. Cases like this are deeply unsettling because they challenge something fundamental. The idea that home is supposed to be safe. According to prosecutors, the place Craig should have been safest allegedly became the center of a horrifying concealment. And for many following the case, the most disturbing detail remains this: authorities believe Craig never left the property at all. As of today, legal proceedings connected to the case continue developing publicly. And as always, every defendant is presumed innocent unless proven guilty in court. The allegations against Deana Thetford have been formally filed, but the outcome of the case will ultimately depend on the presentation of evidence in court and the findings of a judge or jury. What began as a missing persons case evolved into an investigation prosecutors say exposed a carefully maintained lie. And according to investigators, the truth was hidden only a few feet away from where people searched for answers. But behind every headline and every courtroom filing was a man whose life ended violently. And a family left trying to understand how everything unraveled. And as the legal process moves forward, one question remains at the center of it all. Not just what happened to Craig Thetford, But how a disappearance story allegedly held together long enough to hide the truth in plain sight. Craig Thetford was more than a headline. More than a court case. More than an investigation. He was a father. A family member. Someone people expected to hear from again. And in many ways, that's what ultimately exposed the alleged deception in this case. The people who loved Craig refused to accept that he had simply vanished without explanation. They kept asking questions. And investigators kept digging. Cases like this are deeply unsettling because they challenge something fundamental. The idea that home is supposed to be safe. According to prosecutors, the place Craig should have been safest allegedly became the center of a horrifying concealment. And for many following the case, the most disturbing detail remains this. Authorities believe Craig never left the property at all. As of today, legal proceedings connected to the case continue developing publicly. And as always, every defendant is presumed innocent unless proven guilty in court. Thank you for spending this time with me here on Dark Case Files. These stories are difficult. And I never take lightly the responsibility of telling them. If this video helped you better understand the case, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps this channel continue covering cases that deserve attention. And I'd like to hear your thoughts. At what point do you think investigators realized Craig had never truly disappeared? Leave your thoughts below. Until next time, stay curious, stay aware, and stay safe.